7 years ago, my own mother stood in a courtroom in DuPage County and told a judge I was gone, unstable, missing by choice. 2 years later, that judge signed a document that declared me legally dead. While she withdrew $1.3 million from my trust and expanded her husband's construction company, I was locked inside a farmhouse in Wisconsin, alive, breathing, and listening to my future being rewritten. My name is Alara Whitmore. I was declared dead in 2017, and this is how I came back to testify at my own kidnapping trial. Chapter 1. She signed my death certificate. The first thing I saw was my mother's hands. They were perfectly manicured, pale pink polish, fingers curled stiffly in front of her as the federal agent guided her down the stone steps of her house in Naperville. It was early spring in 2025. The air still held a bite, the kind that settles into your lungs and stays there. A small crowd had gathered across the street. Neighbors, a couple of reporters who had moved faster than I expected. No shouting, no chaos, just a heavy, stunned silence. Vivian Whitmore Caldwell did not look at me. She kept her chin lifted, the way she always did when she walked into a charity gala or stepped up to a podium at the Lakeshore Country Club. Even with her wrists cuffed in front of her, she carried herself like a woman who believed this was a misunderstanding that would soon be corrected. 7 years ago, she signed a set of papers that declared me legally dead. I stood on the opposite sidewalk, my hands shoved into the pockets of my coat, and watched the agents guide her into the back of a black SUV. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vindicated. I felt something colder, something steadier. Because before there were handcuffs and indictments, there were documents. Before there were federal charges, there was a signature. And before that, there was money. In 2014, my grandmother, Margot Whitmore, died quietly in her condo overlooking Lake Michigan. She was 82 years old and sharp until the end. She built her life on real estate investments across Chicago and the western suburbs, buying small commercial properties in the 70s and holding them long enough to watch the city grow around them. She believed in long games. At the reading of her will, I sat between my parents in a downtown Chicago law office that smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. I was 21 then, finishing my final year at Northwestern Community College with a degree in communications. I had internships on my mind, not inheritance. The attorney cleared his throat and began outlining the trust. $4.8 million, established in 2014, to be transferred in full to me when I turned 22 in June of 2015. There was a corporate trustee assigned to manage the assets, and there was a co-trustee, my mother, Vivian. My father, Daniel Whitmore, sat very still as the details were explained. He and my mother had divorced in 2008. The trust language, the attorney said carefully, had been drafted after the divorce. Management authority would remain with the corporate trustee and the named co-trustee until distribution. There was no role for Daniel in overseeing the funds. My father asked one question: could the terms be contested? The attorney gave a sympathetic look. The trust language was airtight. My grandmother had been precise. After the meeting, my mother placed her hand lightly on my arm. "You are not ready to handle that kind of money," she said. "Not yet. We will make sure it is protected." At the time, I thought she sounded concerned. I did not recognize calculation when I heard it. Vivian Whitmore Caldwell lived for appearances. She chaired fundraising committees, hosted luncheons, curated her image carefully on social media. She married my stepfather, Graham Caldwell, in 2013. He owned Graham Commercial Construction LLC, a company that specialized in mid-sized commercial builds in DuPage County. He spoke slowly, as if every word had been pre-approved by a lawyer. By May of 2015, my life felt ordinary in the best way. Finals were over. I was planning a small graduation dinner. My 22nd birthday was a month away, and with it, the transfer of the trust. My mother insisted on hosting a celebration early. "Just family," she said. "We should mark the moment." The house in Naperville was spotless that evening, Candles on the dining table, crystal glasses. Graham poured sparkling water for me himself. I remember lifting the glass and thinking it tasted faintly metallic. I remember blinking, trying to focus on my mother's face across the table as she talked about a new charity initiative. The next clear memory I have is of cold concrete beneath my palms. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on a thin mattress in a basement I did not recognize. No windows at eye level, just a small rectangular opening near the ceiling where a slice of dim light filtered in. The air smelled of dust and insulation. The door opened and Graham stepped inside. "You scared us," he said calmly. "You fainted at dinner." My head pounded. I tried to stand and nearly fell. "Where am I?" He folded his hands in front of him. "There are some things we need to handle before June. Legal matters. You are not in a stable state right now, Alara. You know that." I stared at him. I know that I was at dinner. He did not argue. He placed a folder on a small folding table. "Power of attorney documents. Temporary, just until you're feeling more like yourself." I did not touch the papers. "I want to call my dad," I said. "That is not a good idea," he replied. "He's already worried enough about you." I laughed then, a short sound that didn't feel like mine. "Worried about what?" He did not answer directly. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You've been overwhelmed. The trust, the pressure. We are protecting you." "From what?" "From yourself." In the days that followed, I understood that I was not being protected, I was being contained. I did not see my mother during that first week, but I heard her voice once through the door. Calm, controlled. "Has she signed anything?" she asked. "Not yet," Graham replied. There was a pause. Then my mother's voice again. "Keep her comfortable. This will be easier once the paperwork is filed." Paperwork. In July of 2015, while I was still in that basement in Naperville, a petition was filed in DuPage County declaring me missing. Affidavits accompanied it, statements from family members attesting that I was emotionally unstable, that I had expressed a desire to leave, that I had cut off contact before. My old emails were printed and selectively highlighted. A message where I vented about stress became evidence of volatility. A therapy appointment from 2 years earlier was framed as proof of instability. My father tried to push back. He called the police when I stopped answering his texts. He went to my apartment in Chicago and found it empty. He demanded an investigation. He was told there was no sign of foul play. He was told adults leave all the time. What he did not know was that the legal machine had already begun moving. The petition was only the first step. It would take time, court dates, additional filings, but the foundation was being laid. On paper, I was no longer a young woman about to receive her inheritance. I was a risk, a problem, a person who chose to disappear. Back in that basement, I began to understand something terrifying. My absence was not an accident. It was an argument being built line by line, affidavit by affidavit, in courtrooms I would never see. I sat on the thin mattress one evening, listening to the hum of the furnace above me, and imagined my name being spoken in a courthouse without me there to answer. I imagined my mother nodding sullenly as she described my supposed fragility. I was alive, I was breathing, and somewhere in DuPage County, a legal record was being created that suggested otherwise. That was the moment it settled in. They were not trying to convince me to sign anything anymore. They were preparing to move forward without me. Chapter 2. The story they built about me. The first time I heard my own voice used against me, it was not in a courtroom. It was through a thin basement door, filtered through the low murmur of my mother's calm explanation to someone on the other end of a phone call. She said I had always been sensitive. She said I had struggled with pressure. She said I talked about leaving, about starting over somewhere no one could find me. Each sentence was technically true. That was the brilliance of it. In the weeks after I refused to sign the power of attorney, my world narrowed to concrete walls and measured footsteps. Graham brought meals at regular intervals. He never shouted. He never threatened in obvious ways. He spoke like a project manager outlining a timeline. "You can make this easy," he would say, "or you can make it complicated." "What happens if I do nothing?" I asked once. He gave a small shrug. "The courts will sort it out." I did not understand at first what he meant. I thought they still needed me, a signature, consent, something. They did not. By late summer of 2015, I was no longer in Naperville. I woke up one morning to the vibration of movement. My wrists had been loosely bound, not tight enough to bruise, just enough to discourage resistance. When I lifted my head, I saw the interior of a cargo van. The drive was long. When the van finally stopped and the doors opened, I smelled hay and damp earth. The air felt different, thinner, cleaner. The property in Wisconsin sat on 50 acres of farmland, quiet and isolated. Graham owned it through a holding company. There was a small farmhouse and a detached garage. My room was upstairs this time, a converted storage space with a single narrow window too high to reach without a chair. Moving me across state lines was not an emotional decision, it was logistical. Later, I would understand how that detail mattered legally. At the time, it just meant I was farther from Chicago, farther from my father. Outside those walls, the story about me was taking shape. My mother met with officers from the Chicago Police Department and repeated the narrative she had begun constructing in DuPage County. Ilara has been overwhelmed. She has talked about disappearing before. She has always been dramatic. She provided printed emails, messages I had sent to friends about feeling lost after graduation, a note where I wrote that sometimes I wanted to get in my car and drive until the skyline disappeared in the rearview mirror. They were normal thoughts for a 22-year-old trying to find her footing. In the hands of a careful storyteller, they became evidence. Dr. Camille Rhodes was contacted for confirmation. I had seen her briefly in 2013 during the fallout of my parents' divorce. She testified only that I had experienced stress related to family conflict. That was all she knew. In the affidavits, her neutral words were stretched: emotional fragility, difficulty coping. My father filed motions to reopen the missing person case. He called detectives weekly. He drove to the Naperville house and stood on the sidewalk when my mother refused to answer the door. He was told there was no indication of foul play. Adults are allowed to leave. Adults are allowed to cut off contact. The phrase voluntary disappearance appeared in the case notes. In Wisconsin, I marked time by the changing angle of sunlight through the narrow window. I did not have access to news. I did not know how far the legal process had advanced. Graham would sometimes sit in a chair across from me and update me in a tone that suggested he was discussing the weather. "Your father filed another motion," he said once in early 2016. "It will not go anywhere." "What are you telling the court?" I asked. "The truth," he replied, "that you were struggling, that you chose to leave." I laughed again, softer this time. "You drugged me." He tilted his head slightly. "Prove it." The petition filed in July of 2015 did not immediately erase me. It set in motion a waiting period. Additional affidavits were required. Notices were published in local papers. Attempts to contact me were documented. Each step created the appearance of due diligence. Nearly 2 years passed. In 2016, under the authority of the trust, withdrawals began. The corporate trustee authorized distributions based on representations from the co-trustee. Funds were allocated for investment opportunities and business expansion. Between 2016 and 2018, $1.3 million moved from the trust into accounts associated with Caldwell Commercial Construction, LLC. Those transfers were executed through wire transactions, clean, documented, signed. The money was used to secure a commercial development project in Aurora, Illinois. Graham positioned it as growth, a natural expansion of his company's portfolio. On paper, it looked like responsible stewardship. By 2017, the legal threshold for prolonged absence had been met. Additional affidavits were submitted. My mother appeared composed before the court, dressed in muted tones, speaking carefully about her missing daughter. She described sleepless nights. She described heartbreak. She described a child who had always been unpredictable. My father attended that hearing. He later told me that when the judge asked if there was any evidence of foul play, my mother shook her head with quiet sadness. The order was signed in 2017. Legally deceased. I was 24 years old. In Wisconsin, I did not know the exact date the order was entered. I sensed a shift, though. Graham's demeanor changed. There was less urgency in his requests for signatures, less pretense that my cooperation mattered. One evening, he entered my room carrying a stack of documents and set them on the small dresser. "It is done," he said. "What is done?" He looked at me steadily. The law recognizes what can be proven. I turned away from him and stared at the wall. Somewhere in DuPage County, a record now existed stating that I was dead, that my estate was settled, that my assets could be managed accordingly. My father was told the decision had been made. He filed objections. They were denied. The trust language gave the co-trustee authority in the event of my death, and according to the court, I was no longer among the living. Friends stopped asking about me. The case file was archived. My apartment lease in Chicago had long since expired. My name began to fade from casual conversation. In the farmhouse, life settled into a grim routine. Graham traveled frequently between Wisconsin and Illinois, overseeing the Aurora project. My mother visited only once. She stood in the doorway of the room and looked at me as if I were a distant relative she didn't quite recognize. "You could have made this easier," she said quietly. "For who?" I asked. She did not answer. She studied my face for a long moment, as if confirming something, then turned and walked away. By the end of 2017, the narrative about me was complete. I was the troubled daughter who left and never came back. The grieving mother had done everything she could. The trust was being managed responsibly. The business was thriving. On paper, Vivian Whitmore Caldwell had fulfilled her duties, and I, legally and financially, no longer existed. Chapter 3. 7 years off the record. Time did not dissolve into one long blur the way people assume captivity does. It sharpened. It separated into cold mornings and humid afternoons, into the sound of wind against tin and the smell of cut hay drifting through a window I could barely reach. By 2017, the farmhouse in Wisconsin had become my entire world. Graham moved me there after the legal proceedings began to solidify. 50 acres of quiet land, no close neighbors, a narrow gravel driveway that curved out of sight before it met the road. The room upstairs where I stayed had slanted ceilings and a single window set too high for escape without help. Graham ran his life like a business operation. Meals at consistent times, lights out at consistent times. He never screamed. He never needed to. "You can still make things easier," he said one evening in 2018 as he leaned against the doorway. "For who?" I asked. "For everyone." "There is no everyone," I replied. "There's just you." He looked at me for a long moment, assessing, as if I were a damaged asset that still had residual value. "You are legally gone," he said quietly. "You understand that. I'm standing in front of you. The law recognizes what can be proven." He closed the door behind him. I survived by structuring my mind. I exercised against the wall, counted breaths, replayed Chicago street names in my head so I would not forget them. Lakeshore Drive, Michigan Avenue, Madison Street. I refused to let my identity shrink to a locked room. Rosa Alvarez became the only crack in the controlled system Graham had built. She was 45, slight, always moving quickly as if trying to finish a task before someone noticed she had started it. I overheard enough conversations to understand her vulnerability. Her visa had expired years earlier. Graham kept that fact like a blade at her throat. "You know what happens if I make one phone call," he said to her once, his voice carrying up the stairwell. "I am doing everything," Rosa answered, her voice trembling. "Please." He did not raise his volume. He didn't have to. Rosa began lingering for a few seconds when she brought food upstairs. "You need to eat," she whispered one afternoon, setting down a bowl of soup. "I'm not hungry. You need strength." It was the first time someone in that house spoke to me as if I mattered. Outside those walls, my father refused to accept the narrative. In 2018, Daniel Whitmore sold the home he had lived in since the divorce. He told friends it was time to simplify. In reality, he needed the money. He hired a private investigator. He drove across county lines chasing tips that went nowhere. His friends confronted him one evening in his apartment. "You have to let her go," one of them said gently. "The court declared her dead. You are destroying yourself." My father stood in the doorway of the spare bedroom he had kept intact. My old high school track medals hung from a hook. My bookshelf still held the same paperbacks I left behind. "She is not dead," he said quietly. "I would know." He dusted that room every week. In 2019, something shifted beneath the surface of Graham's confidence. Noelle Caldwell, his daughter, was 24 and far more observant than anyone gave her credit for. She had grown up watching contracts signed and projects negotiated. She understood leverage. At a networking event tied to one of Caldwell's commercial construction projects in Aurora, she ran into Ethan Park. Ethan had been my boyfriend in college. He always cared more about balance sheets than emotions. Smart, ambitious, predictable. Later, I would learn through court testimony what happened that night. Noelle told him the truth. "She's alive," she said, according to the transcript. "My dad is keeping her in Wisconsin." Ethan did not react with outrage. He reacted with calculation. "And if she stays gone?" he asked. "My dad says everything stays stable." Stability meant contracts. Contracts meant growth. Growth meant positions opening at the top. Graham later offered Ethan an informal understanding. Once the Aurora development stabilized, there would be room for a chief financial officer, someone trusted. Silence in exchange for opportunity. Back in the farmhouse, I sensed Graham's tension increasing in subtle ways. He installed another deadbolt on the downstairs door. He began checking my room twice each night. "You're thinking too much," he told me in late 2020. "I'm listening too closely." He stepped closer, his expression flattening. "You are alive because we allow it." I met his eyes. "You're alive because the law allows it." He did not like that. By 2021, I had memorized the rhythm of the house, the way the third stair creaked under weight, the timing of deliveries, the pattern of Graham's trips back to Illinois to oversee the Aurora project. He drove north to Milwaukee occasionally for meetings. Those drives mattered. They created space. In early 2022, snow lined the edges of the driveway, dirty and compacted for weeks of cold. Graham mentioned casually that he would be in Milwaukee for 2 days. "Keep things calm," he told Rosa before leaving. "I always do," she replied. That night, Rosa brought dinner upstairs and hesitated at the threshold. "He leaves at 6, she whispered. "I know." She stepped inside fully for the first time. Her hands shook as she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small flip phone. "For emergencies," she said. My pulse thundered in my ears. "He checks everything," I said. "Not this. I keep it in my car." "Why are you helping me?" She looked at me, really looked at me. and something in her expression broke. "Because you are not dead." She left before I could say anything else. The next morning, when Graham's truck disappeared down the driveway, I waited another hour to be sure. The house was silent. I retrieved the phone and flipped it open. There were no contacts saved. I did not need them. I dialed the one number I had repeated in my mind for 7 years. It rang twice. "Hello?" His voice sounded older, rougher. I swallowed hard. "Dad." Silence, then a sharp breath. "Alara, I'm alive." There was no shouting, no hysteria, just the sound of him breathing as if he had been holding it for years. "Where are you?" "Wisconsin, a farmhouse. I don't know the exact address." "Stay where you are. Don't try to run alone. I'm coming." "I don't know how long I have." "I'm coming," he repeated. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. I hid the phone beneath a loose board in the corner of the room and sat very still. Every passing car sounded like Graham returning early. Every gust of wind felt like footsteps on the stairs. Late the next evening, headlights swept across the thin curtains. A car engine idled in the driveway, not Graham's truck. There was a knock at the front door, firm, controlled. Rosa's voice drifted upward. "Can I help you?" Then my father's voice, steady and unmistakable. "My name is Daniel Whitmore. I'm here for my daughter." Footsteps on the stairs, the lock turning. The door opened. He looked older, his hair grayer, but his eyes were the same. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled me into him. "You're here," he said into my hair. "I'm here." He stepped back just enough to look at my face, as if I were a hallucination. "We're leaving," he said. There was no dramatic confrontation. Graham was hundreds of miles away. Rosa stood at the bottom of the stairs, hands clasped tightly, watching us. "Thank you," I told her as we passed. She nodded once. Outside, the air felt sharp and painfully clean. I slid into the passenger seat of my father's car. As we drove down the long gravel driveway, I looked back at the farmhouse. It looked ordinary, peaceful even. That was the cruelest part. When we crossed back into Illinois, my father reached over and squeezed my hand without taking his eyes off the road. "You're safe," he said. Not yet, I thought, but for the first time in 7 years, I was no longer invisible. Chapter 4. Justice is built on paper. The first place my father took me was not home. It was a hospital just outside Chicago. I sat on the edge of a narrow exam table while a nurse checked my blood pressure and asked routine questions in a soft voice. How long had I been missing? Had I been restrained? Was I injured? I answered steadily, surprised by how calm I sounded. My father stood near the door the entire time, arms folded tightly across his chest, as if bracing against something unseen. When the doctor left the room, he turned to me. "We're not going to handle this alone," he said. "I know." He made one call before we even left the parking lot. Howard Keene answered on the second ring. Howard had been an FBI agent before he retired. He and my father had met years earlier during a fire investigation that crossed into federal jurisdiction. They had stayed in touch. "She's here," my father said into the phone. "She's alive." There was a pause on the other end. "Bring her to me," Howard replied. We drove straight to Howard's office downtown. He was 74 now, slower in his movements, but sharp in his eyes. He listened without interrupting as I described the basement, the farmhouse, the phone call. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "This isn't just a missing person," he said. "This is interstate transport and unlawful confinement. And if trust funds were moved based on a false death declaration, we're looking at wire fraud and embezzlement. My father looked at him. Federal? Howard nodded once. Interstate kidnapping alone can trigger it. Add financial transfers across state lines, and it's squarely federal. He did not hesitate. He contacted former colleagues. Within hours, I was sitting in a conference room speaking to 2 agents from the Chicago field office. They recorded everything: dates, locations, descriptions of rooms and vehicles. I did not dramatize. I gave them facts. You were transported from Illinois to Wisconsin against your will, one agent clarified. Yes. And funds from the trust were transferred electronically while you were declared legally deceased. Yes. They exchanged a look. Chain of custody mattered. Documentation mattered. I understood that now in a way I never had before. My story alone was not enough. It needed proof. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Within weeks, a federal magistrate approved search warrants for both the Naperville residence and the Caldwell commercial construction offices tied to the Aurora project. I was not present during the searches. Howard insisted I should not be. You don't need to relive that part in person, he told me. But I followed every update. Agents entered the Naperville house in the early morning. They photographed each room. They cataloged documents. A licensed locksmith opened a safe hidden behind a framed photograph in Vivian's study. Everything was logged, everything bagged and tagged. Inside the safe, they found printed emails dated late 2014, messages between Vivian and Graham discussing the trust timeline. One line stood out. Once she is declared absent long enough, the court will have no choice. There were also financial records, wire transfer logs from 2016 through 2021, showing funds moved from the Whitmore Trust into accounts controlled by Caldwell Commercial Construction. The amounts were precise. The dates aligned with the Aurora development milestones. In the company office, agents recovered a USB drive from a locked drawer. It contained an audio file from 2015. The voices were unmistakable. We just need the petition to hold. After that, everything is legal, my mother said on the recording. Graham responded calmly. And she stays quiet? When the agents played that clip for me in a secure room, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not shock, recognition. They had planned it. Not impulsively, not out of panic, deliberately. The message that sealed it came from my own phone records. After I returned to Illinois, I texted my mother from a new number. I needed to see how she would respond. I wrote one sentence: I am alive. Her reply came within minutes. You are just a mistake from my past that I want to forget. The agents extracted the message directly from the service provider. It was authenticated, time-stamped, impossible to dismiss as fabrication. When Vivian learned she was under investigation, she did not call my father. She called me. Her voice was steady. Ilara, I heard you have been speaking to people. I have. You are confused. You were not well in 2015. We did what we thought was best. I was locked in a basement. A small exhale on the line. You are remembering it wrong. I have records, I said quietly. Emails, transfers, a recording. Silence stretched between us. You are making a mistake, she finally said. No, you did. The call ended there. The story began to leak before indictments were formally announced. The Chicago Tribune published an investigative piece outlining irregularities in the Whitmore Trust and the suspicious timeline of my legal death declaration. They did not name me at first. They focused on the financial angle. Then the full story broke. Lakeshore Country Club issued a statement suspending Vivian's membership pending review. Photos of her from charity galas disappeared from the organization's website within days. Noelle Caldwell retained counsel and entered negotiations. She agreed to cooperate, admitting she had known since 2019 that I was alive and had remained silent in exchange for professional advancement. Ethan Park was subpoenaed and questioned multiple times. He denied direct involvement in the confinement. The evidence did not support criminal charges against him, but his firm terminated his employment. No company wanted their chief analyst linked to a federal investigation involving fraud and kidnapping. Graham attempted to present the financial transfers as legitimate business investments authorized by the co-trustee, but the foundation of those transfers rested on a fraudulent declaration of death. The indictment was returned in early spring of 2025. Federal agents arrived at the Naperville house mid-morning. There were no dramatic chases, no shattered windows, just a knock on the front door and a warrant. Vivian opened it herself. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent began. She did not resist. She did not argue. She looked past the agents and scanned the street, perhaps searching for cameras. Graham was taken from his office in Aurora later that afternoon. Employees watched as he was escorted through the lobby. I stood across the street from the Naperville house when they led my mother down the steps in handcuffs, the same steps where she had once posed for holiday photos. She did not look at me. The charges were unsealed the following day: interstate kidnapping, wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. My name appeared in the indictment not as deceased, but as victim. For 7 years, I had existed only in footnotes and false affidavits. Now, my existence was a matter of federal record. The legal process had only begun, but the narrative had shifted. For the first time since 2015, the story about me was being written in a courtroom, not in a locked room. And this time, I was there to answer. Chapter 5: The Verdict. The courtroom felt smaller than I expected. Federal courtrooms always look imposing on television. In reality, the space in downtown Chicago where my case was tried felt almost restrained. Wood-paneled walls, the seal of the United States mounted behind the bench, a row of reporters seated quietly along the side. It was 2024 when the trial began. I sat beside my father, hands folded in my lap, listening as the clerk read the charges against Vivian Whitmore Caldwell and Graham Caldwell. Interstate kidnapping, wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. My mother wore a navy suit and minimal jewelry. Her hair was pulled back neatly. She did not look at me. ADA Melissa Grant stood and addressed the jury in a clear, steady voice. "This is a case of financially motivated parental kidnapping," she said. "The defendants orchestrated the disappearance of an adult daughter in order to gain control of a multi-million-dollar trust." There was no drama in her tone, no theatrics, just facts. The evidence unfolded slowly over days. Bank transfer logs were displayed on screens, dates and amounts. Funds moved from the Whitmore Trust to Caldwell Commercial Construction between 2016 and 2021. $1.3 million routed through wire transactions tied directly to the Aurora development. Email exchanges from late 2014 were entered into evidence, messages in which Vivian and Graham discussed timelines and legal strategy. Once she is declared absent long enough, the court will have no choice. The courtroom was silent when the audio file from 2015 was played. My mother's voice filled the room. "We just need the petition to hold. After that, everything is legal." Graham's response followed, "And she stays quiet." I did not look at them while it played. Rosa Alvarez took the stand next. Her hands trembled at first, but her voice steadied as she described the farmhouse in Wisconsin, the locked door, the threats about immigration. "He told me if I spoke, he would call ICE," she said. "He said I would be deported." "And why did you eventually help Alara?" ADA Grant asked. Rosa glanced at me. "Because she was not dead," she replied. Dr. Camille Rhodes testified about her limited sessions with me years earlier. She clarified that she had never diagnosed me with instability or any condition that would justify confinement. Her words had been mischaracterized in affidavits. My father testified last among the key witnesses. He described the day he was told the court had declared me legally deceased. I knew she was alive, he said simply. I just did not know where. The defense attempted to argue that I had been unstable, that I had chosen isolation, that the trust funds were legitimate investments. ADA Grant responded by projecting the text message from 2022 on the screen. I am alive. You are just a mistake from my past that I want to forget. There was no way to spend that. The verdict came after 2 days of deliberation. Guilty on all major counts. When the judge pronounced sentence later that year, his voice carried the weight of finality. Vivian Whitmore Caldwell was sentenced to 24 years in federal prison without eligibility for early release under the applicable guidelines. Graham Caldwell received 26 years due to additional financial crimes tied to the wire fraud and embezzlement counts. Noel Caldwell, who had accepted a plea agreement and cooperated with investigators, was sentenced to 4 years. Ethan Park was not criminally charged. The evidence did not establish direct participation in the confinement, but the transcripts of his testimony became public record. His firm terminated his employment. The career he had built around precision and credibility dissolved under the weight of association. The trust did not simply vanish. My grandmother had included a provision in the original 2014 trust, known as a suspicious death clause. If the beneficiary's death appeared irregular or contested, a secondary reserve would be activated pending investigation. That clause, combined with funds recovered through asset forfeiture, allowed nearly $3.9 million to be restored after legal expenses. Money I had once imagined using to travel, to build a life in some undefined future. Now it carried a different meaning. I visited my mother once in federal custody. The room was sterile. Plastic chairs bolted to the floor, a guard standing near the door. She looked thinner, paler, but her posture remained controlled. "You look well," she said. "I am," I replied. She folded her hands on the table between us. "You could have handled this privately. You did not have to destroy everything." "You destroyed it," I answered. She exhaled slowly. "I did what I thought was necessary." "For what?" I asked. "For stability." I studied her face. For the first time, I did not see power there. I saw someone who had mistaken control for love. "I forgive you," I said. Her eyes flickered, surprised. "Not because you deserve it, because I do not want to carry this for the rest of my life." She did not respond. When I stood to leave, she said my name softly, "Alara." I paused but did not turn back. By 2023, even before the trial concluded, I had begun laying the groundwork for something new. Second Signal Foundation. The name came from the idea that sometimes the first cry for help goes unheard. The second signal needs someone listening. With recovered funds and a small team of advisors, I established the nonprofit in Chicago. We focused on families of missing adults whose cases had stalled. We helped them hire investigators. We provided legal consultations to review questionable death declarations. We made noise where silence had settled. By 2025, we had helped 14 families reopen cold files. Some cases ended in reunions, others ended in answers that were painful but real. On a quiet afternoon that spring, my father and I sat on a bench near Lake Michigan with paper cups of vanilla ice cream melting faster than we could eat it. The skyline rose behind us, the water stretched endless and blue in front of us. "You know," he said, staring out at the horizon, "I used to picture this day differently." "How?" "If you came back, I thought I would feel anger, rage, something explosive. And now," he glanced at me, "I feel grateful." I nodded. For years, I imagined justice as something loud, something dramatic. In reality, it was built on paperwork, on recorded calls, on timestamps and signatures. It was built on proof. I was declared dead once because someone controlled the narrative. I stand here now because the truth was documented line by line. If you have ever been told your voice doesn't matter or that your story can be rewritten without you, remember this: paper can erase, but paper can also restore. If this story meant something to you, share it, talk about it, Stay with us as we continue telling stories that refuse to disappear. And if you want to learn more about the work Second Signal Foundation does for families who are still waiting for answers, you can find that information in the description. I am no longer invisible, and this time, the record is correct.